So good morning, everybody. So I don't know if you all are like me, but I just can't believe that 2018 is almost over, right? I woke up this morning looking, I'm like, man, it is December 7th. Like, I can't believe that Christmas is only a few days away. I feel like on my flight home, I'm going to be frantically Amazon priming to be ready for all of that. But as the year is surprisingly coming to an end, it's a great time to look back on 2018, particularly in the areas of education policy and of school choice policy, and then also to look ahead to the future. So we have put together an outstanding panel this morning to take a look both at the national landscape with respect to federal policy and a kind of broad brush look at developments in choice policies over 2018, and to do a little bit of looking towards the future. So what might 2019 hold for school choice policy? And to kick off that discussion, I could think of no one that I would rather have taking this big picture look than ExcelinEd's own Adam Peshek, who is the Managing Director of Opportunity Policy. So Adam, if you want to give sort of your thoughts looking back on 2018 and the lay of the landscape right now.
Yeah, great. And thanks for sticking around. After Howard Fuller's talk, I was ready to just go run out into the streets and kind of end it. Having to follow Howard Fuller any day or a week later is a pretty ridiculous thing you have to ask to do. But so I changed what I was going to talk about because Howard Fuller had said something pretty interesting. He was asked a question about, are we losing in school choice? How can we turn around the losing? And I do think that it's important because we do kind of think of policy. I mean, some people are thinking about policy because of the elections a month ago. Some people are thinking about the policy of 2018. But I think it's really important to kind of look at kind of where we've gone over the past, 25 years that Howard Fuller was talking about. So if you look at choice programs in 1999, you see Wisconsin there with a star. That's where Howard Fuller started the first program in 1990. A few years later, Ohio copied them with the Cleveland program. Arizona passed a program in 1997. And then Governor Bush in Florida passed the McKay Scholarship Program in Florida. So in 1999, we had 4 school choice programs serving a few thousand students. Jump ahead a few years. I'm not sure if this is on. Oh, there we go. In 2005, we were up to 10 programs in 6 states. So those green stars and blocking you see there were the new programs: Ohio, Pennsylvania, D.C. Not a ton of progress. You jump ahead to 2011, 25 programs in 12 states plus D.C. Those blue states were the states that adopted choice programs between 2005 and 2011, as well as D.C. And then you jump ahead to today, 52 programs. Actually, say 53 or 54, depending on how you count it, programs in 26 states plus DC. And filling in maps is important. We like to fill in maps. It's not all you want to do is see 50 states. You want to see real growth with students. And if you look, right now, in 2018, about 487,000 students were enrolled in 54 programs in 26 states and DC. And if you look at those early years, that first 10 years or so, we barely, budged the 10,000 students per year limit. And now you see that growth chart is just going up and up. This year will easily pass 500,000 students. So it's good to put things in perspective when we're talking about these private school choice things. Like Howard Fuller said, 25 years of progress, 25 more years is going to be amazing where we go. 2018, 2019, the future, there are a lot of things that I think states talking to me are starting to realize and learn about. So a study came out this year from Education Next, and I think it's important to notice that for years, probably since the beginning, there's been this kind of existential battle in the school choice world. Should school choice be for low-income students, or should it be for all students? And it's kind of like any time you get into a policy discussion, you say, what about drug policy? Should we have legalization? It's not should you have that legalization in the middle, it's should we go to the full bore or should we have nothing? Should we, if we have one thing, should we have all the way or not all the way? And I think that one of the things that we need to remember is that if you look at the studies, the middle class, the middle income people in America are rapidly losing access to private education. This is a study that came out by Education Next this year. And they found that since about the 1970s or so, the share of middle income people exercising private education choice has almost halved. And during that time, people at the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile of incomes has actually remained pretty steady. So what does that tell you? that tells you that that low-income class there, the green bar you see at the bottom, still pathetically low, 5%. But because of the 400,000 or so low-income students are being eligible to go to private schools because of these programs, we've been able to kind of prevent any losses that we're seeing in other areas. The high-income class, there's been some variation there, but largely they've been able to pay for private education. That middle-income class, which on the study is about $68,000, they're losing access rapidly. And there's a number of reasons why. If you read any of the issues with the middle-income people today, there's a lot of reasons: increasing healthcare costs, increasing education costs, lots of different issues. So the one point that I wanted to make, and that a lot of people ask, is what income limit should you set these programs at? How much is too much? It always goes to, well, if it's a universal program, are we going to let millionaires' kids in? I think it's important to really just think about whatever income limit you're setting these programs at. There's going to be some real people that are either going to benefit or not benefit. And just before this, I looked up the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They list the average income for different occupations by state. And I looked at Florida, and just arbitrarily, because the limits that we have in our school choice programs in Florida, about $65,000 for a family of four allows you to participate or not participate. So that means in Florida, on average, a registered nurse with 2 kids can't participate. But a police officer and a hairdresser, they can. A teller and an electrician, they can't participate. An EMT worker and a school social worker, they can't participate. So we need to remember that when we're talking about moving school choice towards more income levels, this isn't talking about the wealthy getting more. This is talking about real working class individuals who are working 2 jobs, who are being priced out of their houses, who are having to work long hours. Those are the folks that are not benefiting from private school choice programs by and large that we need to start pushing. And so I've talked to about people from 10 different states at this conference. They've all said they're going to file school choice bills. And I said, just remember that when you're deciding what that income limit is, you're setting an arbitrary number, but those arbitrary numbers have real impacts on people across the country. So you need to think about that when you're doing it. And so one other thing that I wanted to talk about, as we're talking about the future and what people are looking towards, we often think about private school choice as that Catholic school, that parochial school, and Mike's going to talk about this a little bit later, but when you're creating policies, remember that the world of education is changing, and the private school of the past isn't anything like the private school of the future. So we're seeing a lot more micro, small schools that are coming up that are kind of starting small and expanding with success. We're seeing hybrid homeschools where maybe a kid's in what looks like a school 3 days a week, but they're being homeschooled 2 days a week. We're seeing people who are doing half-day school, they're doing therapy on the side, tutoring, and those are all very great models, and they're gonna push us to the future. But the way that we're crafting these policies now are kind of a 1990s style of, you get a voucher to go to an accredited private school that is, meets from 8 to 3 and is there for 180 days. That's kind of an antiquated notion, but our policy hasn't caught up to it. So when you're crafting policies, just remember things like education savings accounts. They're multi-use vouchers, essentially, that let parents use it for private school. They let you use it for tutoring. They let you use it for therapies for students with disabilities. They let you use it for online classes. And that reflects a lot of the stuff that Mike's going to talk about later that really is the future of education and is happening without us telling anyone to do it. These things are happening at the ground level, and a real piece of policy moving forward are creating policies that allow low-income and middle-income families to get some equity out of this and to be able to afford the things that these individuals are doing across the country. So the future of school choice, 2019, 2020, 21, I think it's going to be a focus on higher income classes being able to participate, a focus on customization and allowing people to do more of a do-it-yourself model that allows them to create new private education situations. And I also think it's going to be a real focus on empowering parents with tools, not just financial tools, but tools that help them navigate, help them understand the options they have, and helps them really direct funds to those options. There was an open enrollment panel yesterday, and someone, a lawmaker from Florida, made a great point that if you are a middle or low income parent anywhere across the country, probably once a week you're gonna get a flyer about a new cable company option, you're gonna get a flyer about a new restaurant, you're gonna get a flyer about everything. they never get a flyer about options. They get no idea about what's out there. And there's groups out there like Step Up for Students, like great schools and others that are really harnessing technology that's going to be able to help parents not just identify options, but help them select ones in a customized way that helps them pick the option that's best for their child's environment. So with that, I'll turn it over to the rest.
Great, thanks, Adam. I think that was a great overview looking sort of nationally, both historically and in the present day. So what we'd like to do with our next presentation is drill down a little bit more. So if you were to look at that set of states or policies that exist across the nation that were enacted over the past 20, 25 years. 2018 wasn't necessarily a year where we saw a lot of new programs enacted. So various programs around the country were strengthened, maybe more money was available, or the eligibility criteria were changed, but not a lot of new programs were created. But there was an exception to that, and that was in the great state of Florida. So it is appropriate that we have Representative Byron Donalds, state representative from District 80 in Florida, which for those of you that don't know your electoral districts in Florida, it stretches from the eastern outskirts of Fort Myers and Naples up to Lake Okeechobee in the center of the state. Much maligned Central Florida. I remember from the lunch keynote yesterday, one of the things I took away from that moment was that gentleman wasn't a big fan of Central Florida. And I was like, come on, man, take it easy on Orlando. It's a perfectly nice. Disneyland's great, but it's more than alligators and heat. But anyway, I digress. Representative Donalds, if you could talk about some of the efforts that were in Florida and lessons that y'all learned, that would be great.
Sure. First thing I was going to tell you is be careful talking about Central Florida. Actually, I also saw your map. It's apropos that Florida was purple on your map. I think we see that most of the time when we have statewide elections in our state. In 2018, one of the major policy initiatives that we passed with respect to private school choice or choice in general was the Hope Scholarship Program. We were actually, is any of our policy staff in this room? Any House policy staff? I see y'all in here? Okay, good. I'm gonna take all credit. So when I was doing all of my research with policy staff, what we were noticing were the amount of incidents of violence in our schools. And this is something that is not a Florida thing. That is, frankly, a school thing. And so we noticed that in 2015-16, there were about 65,000 reported incidents of physical violence, threats, theft, physical assault, battery, so on and so forth. What we also realized is that if you actually conducted surveys of school therapists, there were about another 150 to 180,000 that were never reported to the school. So take a step back and understand. You have a child, whether they might be in the 4th grade, in the 7th grade, in the 10th grade, they've been physically assaulted or sexually assaulted. They are sometimes sitting in the same classroom with the student that carried out the assault or what happened. And then we're still asking that same student to perform academically, put on a brave face, be a part of the school culture. At the same time, the parents are watching this child come home. They're realizing that something's wrong with my child, number one. Their grades may be slipping. They're not interested. They're cutting school. They're cutting class. They're not showing up in the lunchroom. All the things that all of us have seen or been a part of when we were in school ourselves. So in Florida, what we said was we're going to create a program called the Hope Scholarship Program, that if there is an incident that occurs in a school, the school district has a responsibility to notify the parents 15 days after the incident occurred of what their transfer options are. The 3 transfer options could be moving to another school within the public school district. It could be moving to a local charter school, or it could apply for what we call the Hope Scholarship. And that would allow the child to transfer to a private school. The basic premise is this: in any other walk of life, when somebody is victimized, a lot of times we try to tell the victim, just get out of that situation. But when we were going through this policy debate, the most interesting thing happened. On the floor of the House and in every committee, the debate wasn't, let's just get the victims to a place where they can thrive. The debate was, don't tell the victims to leave. That's not fair to them. Why don't we just get rid of the bullies and get the bullies out of there, get the perpetrators out of there? So I remember one exchange I was having with a member, and I said, well, Representative, what you're talking about is the old reform school system that we got away from. But we used to have reform schools where we would take all the perpetrators, put them into one school, and that's how we would just educate them over there. Anyway, so the program essentially works that way. After 15 days, the parents are notified. And then at that point, the parents then are armed with information about what they want to do for their child. You know, I have 3 sons. So I've moved my sons between schools because what a parent is really looking for is the best environment for their child to thrive and to be nurtured and to reach the potential that all parents see in the eyes and in the hearts of their children. But when you make that decision to transfer a child, it's not something that's just a flippant decision. You don't just say, well, I like that school over there because I like their colors or I like their mascot, so you're just going over there. There's a lot of decisions, a lot of research, a lot of soul searching, a lot of prayer, a lot of talking to other families in the community, people that go to that school, people tour schools. Like all these things go into the transfer decision. But the thing we wanted to recognize is that if a child does not feel safe in an environment, how could we possibly expect them to learn in the same environment? And that was the premise of the Hope Scholarship. Now, specifically how we went about funding it, we actually took a little bit of a page out of our Florida Tax Credit Scholarship. And what we did was we said, okay, for automobile sales in the state of Florida, if somebody buying a new car made a decision when they were going through the paperwork at the auto dealer, how many people have done that in this room? Raise your hand. You all have. It's okay. You can raise your hands. We all have done it, and you go through all the finance paperwork with before you take the car home. Well, there will be another sheet that would come before you, and the auto dealer would say, "Would you like to donate $105 to this program, the Hope Scholarship Program to help children who are being affected by school violence?" And so that is what we did. We essentially created a mechanism where people buying automobiles in our state, about 4 million auto sales a year, could donate to this program. We anticipated in the first year, which is actually, frankly, just started, that we would raise probably about $40 million, which creates scholarships for about 7,200 students in the state of Florida. Because the key thing is trying to get the opportunity to address the need that does exist. When we were going through the committee process, here's some of the things we found out. We had some parents who said, I wish this was here for my child when they were going through their issues, because I decided to just homeschool my child, because I just couldn't take it anymore. Because we would talk to the teacher, we would talk to the principal, we would talk to the school district. The school district would assure us that it wouldn't happen anymore, but it did, and my child is still crying. I had a young lady in my school district, in my district specifically. She actually went to the middle school, which is down the street from my house. And I've known the family for years. And they would say, listen, our daughter was being sexually assaulted by another girl in middle school. And so after 2 or 3 months of trying to fix it, trying to work it out, we just said enough, and we pulled them out. And they decided to homeschool their daughter. So these are the real life accounts that were going on. And in Florida, we decided that we're going to take a stand and try to address that specific need. At the end of the day, and I think Senator Sass said it best in yesterday's breakfast, the arguments we are having are really not funding arguments. I mean, I get it, of course, the NEA and AFT always are arguing about more funding, but it's really not a funding argument. The arguments we are really having is who gets credit. Like which group of adults is getting credit for educating these children? And if you go into the 21st century, or if you look at economic markets, where you get the best bang for your buck, where you get the largest output for the people that are served, is when you have a dynamic market economic system where people are getting the services that they need, regardless of who gets credit. Largely in education, I'm not telling you something you don't already know. We are under the Blockbuster Video model of education, where basically if you want to get your home entertainment, you better go to Blockbuster because it really isn't another game in town. And for a lot of families across the country, not just in Florida, that's the case. Even today, with as much as we've grown in school choice. But to really be dynamic and to really be effective to address the needs of every child, it has to be much more dynamic from an economic perspective. So the Hope Scholarship does create a change in the economics of how we fund education. But the thing, I think, if you take a step back just from that reform in 2018 and you look at the future, we have to get to a space where we're less concerned about the building that we're in or who gets credit or what system took responsibility for getting that child to be successful in life, instead of us all pulling towards a system where the focus is making sure the child is successful in life in life, excuse me, and then the adults can argue over market share and who's gonna get all the credit for it. I really think that's the future of economic reform, excuse me, because I'm melving topics. Education reform, but that's the future. And I think the hardest part is going to be changing from an older system to a newer system. But if you're going to have a system designed for the 21st century, to educate children in the 21st century and beyond, you have to have a system that's compatible with doing that. And so that's what we did in Florida this last year in 2018. Stay tuned for more. We'll see what happens. And thank you for being here.
Great. Oh, absolutely. I'm never going to stop a round of applause. Our final speaker today is going to speak about something that happened at the federal level. So we've been taking a national look, but at things that are going on in states. We've drilled down to the individual state of Florida, great state of Florida. The federal government made some changes to our tax laws and expanded the use of 529 plans to apply to K-12 users, which I think has broad implications. Some various states have chosen to make changes as a result of this. So to give us a little bit of an overview of that, of what happened there and what states are doing, we have Tori Bell, who's a policy analyst for educational opportunity at ExcelinEd.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for everybody for coming to this panel today. As Mike mentioned, the federal government made changes to the federal tax code with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and expanded the use of 529 plans to include K-12 tuition. So we partnered with our friends at AFC and EdChoice to do some research on how states were responding to that change. And I thought it'd be helpful here today to go over 3 main points. What exactly are 529 savings plans, for those who don't know? How exactly have they changed? And the third point, how are states responding to this change? So in 1996, Congress passed 529 plans into law and named them after Section 529 of Federal Tax Code. And these plans were created to help incentivize families to save for higher education expenses. The plans are similar to a Roth IRA in that contributions to this plan are made with after-tax dollars. So the funds grow tax deferred, and as long as the funds are used for a qualified expense, the withdrawals are tax and penalty free. So it can be helpful to think about it this way. A Roth IRA is an investment account for retirement, and a 529 savings plan is an investment account for education. Parents of beneficiaries are typically the ones who contribute to a 529 account, but an account holder can actually be anybody, a grandparent, a neighbor, a mentor, and per IRS guidance, anyone can set up a 529 and name anyone a beneficiary. So there are also no tax consequences if an account owner changes the beneficiary to somebody else within the family. And there's no time limit on when 529 plan funds have to be used. So 529 plans are state-sponsored plans, and they differ state by state. So some states offer a deduction or a tax credit for contributions that are made to the plan, and account holders can actually choose to invest in any 529 plan in another state that's not their home state. It is important, however, to note that the state tax treatment of a withdrawal is determined by the state where the taxpayer files their income taxes. So how have 529 plans changed? Historically, as I mentioned earlier, the plans have been used for higher education expenses alone, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expanded the use to include K-12 tuition. So to put it simply, once it was signed into law, families could use $10,000 per year per beneficiary for K-12 tuition without incurring state tax penalties. So in other words, they will now receive the same federal tax benefits as if they were used for higher education expenses. So state taxes, on the other hand, are a different matter. So to my third point, how is this playing out in the states? Before I discuss some general trends, I wanted to lay some groundwork. So this is important. State laws governing 529 plans differ from state to state, and therefore the federal expansion of 529 plans to include K-12 tuition did not automatically apply to state laws. And this means that some states needed a policy change before residents could use their plans for K-12 tuition. So to break it down, the wonky tax policy in a different way, some state tax codes automatically conformed to the federal code. So when the federal law changed, the state law reflected it. And there are also a handful of states that don't have personal income tax. And in all of these states, 529 funds can be used for K-12 tuition, state and federal tax-free. However, tax codes in some other states did not automatically conform, and in these states, policy changes were needed before the funds could be used for K-12. So in our research, we grouped the states into 4 categories, and in the first one, there are 9 states without personal income tax, and the 529s can be used for K-12 tuition without state tax implications. And the second category, we have 28 states plus DC where no policy change is currently needed, and the funds can be used for K-12 tuition. And in our third category, there are 9 states that currently need a policy change before the funds can be used. There are a handful of states that are currently, it's under legal review or it's not yet been determined. But taking a step back and looking at the full picture, to date, 529s can be used in more than 35 states plus DC for K-12 tuition without incurring state or federal tax penalties. And this includes the 9 states I mentioned that don't have personal income tax, and more than 10 states have actually changed their policies to allow this use. So in conclusion, I'll take a step back. What does this policy change mean? If your home state's tax code conforms to the federal code, and if your 529 funds are used for qualified education expenses, which now include K-12 tuition, the contributions to a 529 savings plan will grow tax-free, the withdrawals they will be tax-free, and your state may offer an additional incentive to contribute to the plan, such as a deduction or a tax credit. So while this was a limited change in policy, it's not a panacea for education. It's still an expansion of opportunity and education freedom, and we believe that's a move in the right direction for policy. So a final note before I close. There's still more that can and should be done for students, especially students from low-income families. Students from low-income families oftentimes don't have the financial means to contribute to a 529 plan. There are some states that offer matching contributions if a low-income family contributes to a 529 plan. So we should continue to do even more to provide high-quality educational opportunity for these students. We plan to continue to track how states are responding in the 2019 legislative session, and we also have more information on our website at ExcelinEd.org, or you can email me at victoria@ExcelinEd.org, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Great. So I think generally speaking, from the school choice perspective, those changes to the tax law were seen as a positive development. But there were some kind of wonky changes and some rulemaking that happened that might not have necessarily been so positive. Adam, could you break that down for us? Or what are some of these rulemaking changes that happen and how might they affect school choice?
Yeah, and 18 months ago, I didn't think I'd be learning about tax policy as much as I have been this past 18 months, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act also created a new $10,000 cap on state and local taxes that individuals can deduct from the federal taxes. Very, very wonky. But politically, essentially what this does is it harms more high tax states than low tax states, because traditionally, states with higher state and local taxes had been subsidized in some ways by the federal government, because if you were being taxed at a very high rate, you could still deduct that amount from the tax that you filed at the federal level. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act got rid of that and allowed only $10,000 of your state and local taxes to be capped. So imagine if you're in a state, very high income individual, maybe $20,000 of state and local taxes, you can only deduct $10,000 of that now. So that extra $10,000 you just can't deduct anymore. So many blue states over the past year, mostly blue states, Connecticut, Maryland, California, New York, a few others, have created some kind of creative workarounds to this by essentially creating mechanisms that look a lot like tax credit scholarship programs, where the state will allow people to donate to an organization that provides grants of some kind for a certain use. So in this case, let's say the state of California, for instance, they create the California Excellence Fund, which allows individuals to donate to this fund, which then goes and provides money for public works like road work, utility work, public parks, that sort of thing. And in exchange for that donor's donation to that organization, they would then give them a credit, 80% credit, 90% credit, even a dollar for dollar credit. And in doing this, you're essentially allowing, these states were allowing to get around the $10,000 cap by continuing to get public funding into these states, while also kind of exploiting the the new federal quirk with charitable donations to allow them to essentially be giving to public works while still lowering their overall tax bill. It's very, very wonky. This became a problem because the IRS has started to target these programs, and essentially by targeting them, they were targeting both state tax credit scholarship programs that do a kind of land conservation in the states, programs that help homeless children in some states, a lot of different programs. And so for the past year or so, the school choice community has been involved with trying to understand how these will work, how it will impact states, what the next steps will be. We were hoping when we planned this panel that we would actually have some word from the IRS, but they still have not filed final rules. The proposed rules would essentially say that any funding that you give to a program that receives a state credit, that state credit has to be considered a benefit to you back. So if you think about this, if you give to PBS and you give them $100 and you get a $25 tote bag back, you can only take that $75 and claim that as charity. And in essence, that's what's going to be happening to tax credit scholarship programs across the country. So in the past, in a few states, if you gave $1,000 to a scholarship organization, you would not only get that $1,000 off your state tax credit if it was 100%, you would also be able to take that and get a deduction from your federal taxes and not, so that in some certain circumstances, you could be giving $1,000 to an organization and be reducing your tax bill by $1,300. Many people have problems with this. They don't want to be able to see that a donation could have a benefit larger than the donation itself. So that's where the IRS is at now. So this is going to be most harmful for states that don't have a 100% tax credit. So there's a lot of states out there that give 75% credits, 50% credits, 65% credits. They're no longer going to be able to claim that extra difference as charity, so you're going to see more harm from donors who are giving to these programs. And our position is state tax credit programs, you should allow dollar-for-dollar donations where you can give to a program and reduce your taxes by that much, but no more. And that's where the IRS is kind of going. There's some implications for corporate donations that have been flagged in a number of states that need to be fixed. There's also some question of inequities for people who are below that $10,000 cap. If you're a middle-income family, you might now be feeling some harm in donating to these programs. So there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and we expect in the next week, 2 weeks maybe, we'll get some guidance, because over the past 6 months, there's been a lot of confusion in the 18 states that have these programs about what's allowed, what's not allowed. Some CPA firms are saying keep donating to these programs. Some CPA firms are saying don't donate to these programs. A lot of wide confusion that we have across the country. But where we're at now is that there's been minimal harm this year, but in 2019, if these aren't going to get solved by the federal government in the next few weeks, there's going to be a lot of confusion come January 1st on what kind of tax treatment these programs are going to get, which could be very harmful to at least 5 or 6 states across the country.
So if we look back over the year 2018, I would be curious what each of you thinks. What is one lesson that the school choice movement learned in 2018? Adam, you can go ahead and start, and then maybe Tori, And then Representative Donalds.
One lesson is don't attach things to tax policy when you don't understand what the tax policy is going to be in the future.
Just a general rule of thumb,
In general
I think,
rule,
just to keep.
I mean, tax policy changes. It changes slowly, but when it changes, it can have massive impacts on what you're doing. So, we tend to like, all types of choice. Publicly funded choice doesn't have to deal with these very often. You don't have to deal with massive changes in the tax code that are going to adjust what's going to happen. But also, we just need to have a closer and deeper eye and understanding of tax policy with these programs because, no one even saw this coming until after it happened, to be honest.
Great. Tori?
I think we learned that teachers can benefit from choice as well. I know we saw in the recent EdChoice schooling survey, Schooling in America survey, that teachers don't feel like they're empowered. And I know there are a couple of things like the Selected. There's some apps where teachers can get paired with schools, and teachers can select into schools that better match their teaching style or values or operating styles for teaching.
Representative Donalds.
I think the biggest thing we probably realized in 2018 is this divergence economically behind where choice is being supported. If you're in, people in lower socioeconomic areas are like all on board with school choice. But even as the data shows, as Adam was showing the chart earlier, families in that middle income area are starting to become very skeptical of choice. And while they might have been skeptical in the weeds, it's now becoming very well known that they're highly skeptical of choice. I think a lot of that stems from they view it as, by you having these programs, you're defunding the school in my community. And so I think that's one of the things in 2018 that I took special note of, that, in the school choice movement, we're going to have to pay special attention to and really focus on how we readjust not just our policy, but the narrative overall.
That's great. So at this time of year, I don't know if it's true in the organizations that you work in, but it's very common when planning it for the year ahead for groups to get together and do a SWOT analysis, right? So you get a big piece of butcher paper and you cut it into 4 quadrants and you do strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? And so I think, a lot of the sessions that we've had over the last couple days, we've got the S and the W down pat. Lots of times we've been talking about strengths and weaknesses of various school choice programs. But I think as we look forward to 2019, I'd like to focus for perhaps a minute on the O and the T. So what are some opportunities and what are some threats? So the first question I would have, and I'll actually take the moderator's prerogative and answer, and then all of you, it'll buy you some time to think of your answers. You're welcome. When we think about opportunities related to school choice, Adam, you referenced, I think, 2 really interesting developments that we're seeing across the country. This idea of microschooling and hybrid homeschooling. And I had this interesting, so I write a column for Forbes. I actually have a new one up this morning, which I would highly encourage all of you to read, breaking down some of those Schooling in America survey findings, and would love to hear your feedback on that as well. No one is usually shy with their feedback when you write a column. But earlier this year, I wrote a column about hybrid homeschooling. So I host a podcast for EdChoice called Cool Schools Podcast. Season 2 is starting after the first of the year, where I interview innovative school leaders. And part of it's just a hobby of mine. I like talking to people who work in schools and talking about the lessons that they've learned. And I happened to interview, just kind of on a lark, because I actually knew someone who sent their kids to this school, a leader of a hybrid homeschool network. So this is a network where kids attend school 2 days a week, or it's either 2 or 3, I always get it confused. 2 days a week, and then for 3 days a week, they're actually homeschooled. And so I thought that some of the things that she had to say were interesting. I thought there were interesting policy implications. So how do we treat these things? Do we call them schools? And what does that mean? So I wrote up a Forbes column on it. And I would say it is the most read thing I have ever written. And I had absolutely no idea what to do that. And to this day, this was probably back in, I think, like May or June, I get 2 or 3 emails every single week from people all across the country that are interested in this idea or thinking about trying to make it happen for their kids or in their community. So I think personally there is this incredible opportunity in 2019 and beyond to really kind of rethink what we call a school. as work gets more flexible and people have different time, as a lot of these incredible resources get cheaper and easier to use. And I think as parental preferences shift, I think the nature of people, it's fascinating to hear these stories that this isn't just a sort of rural phenomenon or a suburban phenomenon. There's like hipsters in Brooklyn that want to do this, and tech people in Silicon Valley. So it's a really sort of broad-based approach all across the country. So I think there is an incredible opportunity to diversify the things that we call schools, and the opportunities that are available there. And now hopefully I've bought all of you enough time to think of your opportunities. So maybe Representative Donald, I'll look to you. What is an opportunity for school choice in 2019?
One of the innovations that it's happened in small areas. We've kind of piloted it here and there. I know in Florida, maybe around the country, is actually reforming the entire school calendar. You know, summer vacation was a thing for go farm the fields. And so I know the amusement park companies love it, and I don't want to speak ill of them, but the reality is that especially for poorer students, summer slide is real. And so I've seen a couple of charter schools in the state of Florida where they've just completely done away with the agrarian calendar, and they've reshaped it. And what their data shows is that there's almost no summer, there's almost no slide. And that the teachers are actually reinvigorated. They're not worn out by March. The students are reinvigorated. They're not worn out by January. And so the learning continues and perpetuates. But I think, as we move forward, we have the gig economy now where people probably have, a job and then they Uber or they Shift or they buy groceries for somebody or whatever they do. But I could definitely see the wave of the future is almost gig education, where parents are finding out what works for their specific child.
That's great. Adam?
So I'll give a threat and an opportunity.
Twofer.
I think a threat that's been going on for a long time, and it's unfortunate, is the siloing of different options into their own camps and infighting. And we break it down here on, we've had a panel here on charter schools, we've had a panel on open enrollment, this is a panel on private school choice. But 10 years ago, most of these people at least worked together against the enemy, which the enemy is forced assignment of children to schools based on the coincidence of where they were born. And what we've seen over the past 5-10 years is that different silos of choice groups, I'm a private school group, I'm a charter school group, I'm an open enrollment group, we're now at the point where I'm a voucher person or a tax credit person, and we lose sight and we do infighting when the real enemy is we're going to force kids into situations that don't work for them just because they have a certain zip code. So the threat is that all this progress that we're making across the country we're gonna just die because we're fighting with each other and not trying to push the ball forward, and that concerns me all the time. So getting those groups back together to kind of understand that they're all trying to fight against the real issue here is one threat. Opportunity that I see is as we're doing more of these customized choice options, parent-driven choice options, is rethinking how we do accountability and test piloting some new ideas about how we think about accountability for schools. In that so much of our accountability is kind of people at the top telling people about schools. Whereas a lot of the way that we do the rest of our life, the way that we pick doctors, we pick restaurants, we pick whatever, movies, anything, is based on the experiences of others. And we can find experiences of other parents and other people, neighbors, that say, hey, how is this school? And kind of get to the nuances that you can't see on a state accountability report. So I think, what I would like to see in the future is, to me, a low level of government intrusion is, hey, if you're getting funding for a private school choice program, if you're going to a charter school and you're a parent, once a year, just rate that school 1 through 5. Make parents do that continuously. So you get a crowdsource of thousands and thousands of parent reviews that can actually push the sector forward in ways that we see with, restaurants and Yelp, travel experiences and Travelocity, and those types of things where it doesn't just say, here's your math and reading scores, that can be part of it, but also says, here's the experience of 100 parents who have had their children in this school, that can really push the sector forward in ways that we haven't had in education yet. So to me, I'd like to see some more experimentation around that to see what that actually leads to.
Great. Tori, an opportunity.
Opportunity similar to Adam, an information-based opportunity. In Florida, nearly half of the student population, the K-12 student population, actually attend a school that's other than their residentially assigned school. So there are tons of opportunities, whether it's through open enrollment, magnet schools, private school choice, charter schools, making sure that parents know within their community what opportunities and choices that they have for their students. Could I add a threat as well?
Yeah, you totally can.
I think we need to do a better job of making the moral case for choice, making the case that every student deserves access to a high-quality education, and I think we can do a better job of that.
That's great. So Representative Donald, I'll let you give your threat. And then after that, we'd like to open up the questions to everyone. So if you have some questions percolating in your minds, I think we have some folks with microphones. So we'll call on you, but this will buy y'all some time to think of a question. So your threat for 2019.
I hate to say this being a representative, but frankly, politics. I mean, that's the biggest one. It's, whether it be the lack of courage of colleagues, I don't want to speak of Florida colleagues because I love all of y'all, but the lack of courage in the political realm to press the envelope. The reality is that the move of school choice is real. Parents are desiring it more and more. The threat from political leaders is when we hear the loud voices that come into the chamber or fill our email box, or yes, donate to campaigns or work on campaigns and things like that. But, I think, everybody wants to get to the same conclusion. I do believe that. But the real threat is that because we've had such of a drive-in choice over the last 20 years, and in some states in particular have really pushed the envelope, that that pushback is real and it's going to come. And so I think it's frankly leaders having the courage to stay the course, because by getting through that block of inertia actually is to the betterment, frankly, of the teachers union. It's to the betterment of teachers. It's to the betterment of school districts. It's to the betterment of superintendents. It's to the betterment of charter school operators and homeschool operators and private school operators, because this is all to the betterment of the children that we all serve.
That's great. I think with respect to politics and education, I often think of it the way Homer Simpson talked about beer, which was it is both the cause of and solution to all of our problems. But I think that works as well. So questions from the audience, looking back on 2018, looking forward to 2019. Looks like we have a question right here. And if you would be so kind as to just state your name, say where you're from, and let us know what you think.
Hey, Captain Ed Davidson from the Florida Keys. Over the last 20 years, attended more than 400 school board meetings. The last four of the last 6 years as an elected member of the school board. This movement started with a lot more discussion of accountability. The biggest weakness, the vulnerability of this movement that I see is the failure to establish common accountability across the board. In the Florida Keys, I have a couple of private schools, a couple of religious schools, a handful of public charter schools, and a dozen traditional. What happens is, and I haven't heard it discussed, and I've been to most of these over the years, kids are going to move in between these various choices. We have some schools that only do the early grades, then they're going to go to a traditional public school. The teachers in that traditional public school deserve to know what the children from various sources have or have not learned, because they're going to have to pick up the slack and compensate for that. There's been some reluctance to accept testing, but if testing is good enough for the majority of students, it has to be good for all students, and so they can move more seamlessly in between these various choices, because that's going to happen. That's a reality, which I've never heard discussed in these forums.
Okay, so maybe some reaction. So talking about on a couple different levels. So accountability, transparency, and also ease of movement between these different sectors. I'd love to hear your responses to that.
Well, look, I think I do agree with you in part. I think that the accountability system, I'm going to talk specifically Florida, has kind of metastasized upon itself. And I think if we're honest, in Florida, what Governor Bush started has grown and grown and grown over the years. And so, in some respects, over the last legislative session, we started to pull stuff back out of the accountability system. I do think that we have to get back to basics in that regard. I mean, when you have a child coming in, should there be a general assessment at any school? Yes. Is there an assessment at the beginning of the year of where your children are? Yes. Is there an assessment at the end of the year of where your children are? Yes. But one of the things that local school districts also have to take responsibility and accountability for are all of the other assessments that they are doing that are not state mandated. So I think it has to be a joint effort between state policy, desiring accountability for the tax dollars that are going in, and then the local districts, to be blunt, trying to make sure that they're making the grade so they do additional assessments as well. Because what it's done is overburdened teachers and it's overburdened students. And I think that's the biggest problem we have in accountability. And so now everybody says, well, this isn't working, so let's just throw it all out. Well, that's not the answer either. But it does have to be more seamless. I do agree with that. And so reformatting that is something that I know I've had some discussions about. We're going to continue to look at it, I know, in our state.
Great.
So I think it's an extremely complicated question, probably more than we can get into in Q&A. We've done panels on this entirely. I think I do fundamentally disagree that all schools need to have the same way of doing things so that we can know which ones are better, because schools are inherently different. We're talking about micro schools, we're talking about hybrid home schools. How you treat a Montessori school versus a classical school versus, the models out there, we should be pushing more diversity in models. And by focusing on one metric, we tend to have things become more homogeneous. And if we were out there and we said, okay, we need a government accountability for car manufacturers, we want to see 60 miles per gallon cars because we want consumers to save. What you'd end up with is a lot of one-seater cars that can go very far but don't do much. And that's great if you're a single person, but if you have 6 kids, what if you need a work truck? There's different things that we need out of education, and having one metric that says, well, that one's better than that one because it's doing this. I think we tend to have more homogeneous, less risk, but less innovation. And part of innovation, everyone throws around this word innovation. Innovation inherently comes with risk. There's going to be failures. There's going to be successes. But over time, the sector moves forward. And I think the question of accountability is accountable to who and accountable for what. With choice, you inherently have more accountability to parents because parents are able to go out there and find the right fit for their child. There should be testing for transparency. There should be transparency of lots of different things, racial composition of schools, extracurricular activities, things that parents care about. But to say that we're going to hold schools accountable on one metric, I tend to think that we're moving beyond that in a strong way. And what that looks like, I think, is arming people with more ability to not only have the information about their school, but giving them the tools and the power to put their kids in schools that fit their desires and needs and learning styles.
Yeah, I would reiterate a lot of what Adam has said and also take it down to the student level. Students are different. You have students with English learning, they're learning the English language. You have students with special needs. And so the accountability system has to be flexible to that.
Great. We have another question over here.
Hi, I'm Jason Botel with Catapult Learning and recovering former acting assistant secretary of elementary and secondary education. Thanks for this conversation very much. One thing I wanted to ask about, children from low-income households who attend private schools are entitled to a proportionate amount of equitable services of title funding, of federal title funding. And it's the same thing for children with disabilities on the IDEA side. From what I can tell, over the past couple of decades, Catholic schools and Jewish school organizations in particular have gotten savvier about making sure their students who are entitled to those services are receiving them. My question is, to what extent, now that we've had this growth in private school scholarship programs, et cetera, to what extent are the schools who are now serving those students, do you think, are they aware of those entitlements? They're actually receiving those services? Do you feel like that's a learning curve that needs to be tackled? Thank you.
That's a great question.
So I think, I'm not the ESSA expert, but I think even ESSA, the federal law, made that equitable sharing, it improved it. So we're going to see more of that. I think you tend to see more established dioceses, those types of things, to be more aware of the services that are provided to them. But the small one-off school probably has very little understanding that exists, and they probably won't unless someone tells them. And even when they're told, they don't have a very strong place at the table to be able to negotiate with districts on that. So I do think in just conversations that it's getting better, a lot because of the ESSA Act and allowing people to get more of that equitable share of funding. But I think I would imagine that the takeout rate of that is very small still, but I don't know.
Yeah, my sort of anecdata on that, I don't know, but this would be a fantastic thing to actually take a look at and see who's taking up with that. I don't know if we have systematic data on uptake on that. It's just what a fight it is to get those resources. And then I think that a lot of school leaders are put in a really difficult situation where they have to weigh a kind of cost-benefit analysis, which is like, I'm going to have to sit in meetings and do all this stuff in order to get this money. Like, what is the value of my time? What's the expected result that's coming from that? But I think that there's great opportunities for those organizations that would like to support school choice to fight for those things and perhaps help smaller one-off schools with the resources that they need. I know there are various organizations that try to do that, but really trying to publicize that and make that available. But a great question. I think we have time for perhaps one or two more. We have one in the front here. I think a microphone is coming your way.
Thank you. My name is Gail Lewis. I'm the founder of Go Forward Education Foundation out of Newtown, Pennsylvania. And going back to the tax scholarship credits, can you speak about the special purpose entity? Because apparently this new change in the tax policy, as you said, prevents potential donors from possibly donating because they're not getting the same tax credit that they would have been.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're recommending this creation of some special purpose entity. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, let's talk offline because it's extremely wonky and state specific, and I don't know if everyone wants to hear about it, but let's talk in a little bit. I mean, basically, we don't know what the IRS is going to do yet. The proposed rules they put out basically just say, if you get 100% credit for a donation to an organization from the state, you can't claim any of that as charity, is essentially where they're at now. If you get a 75% credit for a $1,000 donation, you can't claim any of that $750, but you can claim the $250 because they're thinking the credit back is basically a benefit to you. But I'll talk to you offline because it's, yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. I think in the white jacket here, that would be great.
I'm Jenny Gentles. I work with various school choice organizations and have on and off for 20 years. And Adam, I think I would disagree that this is a new development, that the different sectors are in their own camps, in their own corners, and fighting. They've been doing that for a long time. Maybe it's a little more evident now because there's more at stake because things are actually happening. And these battles are maybe a little more public. But we've been fighting all along. And I've seen it happen at the federal level as well as at the state level now. And I've seen it turn off members of Congress to want to help do anything with school choice. And I'm wondering if that's happening at all in Florida. I worked in Florida. The stakeholders are, vicious there in their treatment of Department of Education. I'm sure that they are equally animated when interacting with politicians. And I'm wondering, what would you recommend stakeholders do as far as how they treat and interact with politicians, perhaps also with department people, if you all have any insight into that? And then Adam, specifically, what's an action item that we can take away from this? We can say, oh, this is bad, we're really fighting. We should get along. What are we going to do to start getting along better?
Well, from the political side, I would tell you first, yes, you are correct. It's not a hot war, but you could see the different battle lines, and it's like anything in life. Everybody has the interest of the organization or the group that they're serving. And so what used to be a battle against just traditional public schooling is now somewhat turning into the Game of Thrones, where everybody's trying to sit on the Iron Throne, essentially. I'm just being honest. That's what it's starting to become. I think the best way for a lot of these groups to deal with legislators is, be clear of your intentions. Be clear about your intentions. Don't try to hide the ball from us, because I know, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but I know for me, the thing that gets me more upset is when you try to hide the ball on me, because then I'm just going to cut you out. I'm not going to deal with you, because if you're not an honest broker with me, and frankly, I'm the one with the vote that's going to file the legislation, then not only am I not going to deal with you today, I'm probably not going to deal with you at all. And once that starts getting around to the other members, that's how you get cut out. I think the important thing to understand, even though everybody is supporting their group that you either advocate for, lobby for, president of, whatever the case might be, is that you almost have to believe in your talent and your ability, and not so much look to cut down the other group that you're opposing. Because if you're doing that in the choice movement, who, basically still, the Lannister army is still the biggest army. They have the gold. And so if you're busy cutting yourselves down in the field, trying to figure out who's coming, who's going to be next, they're just kind of sitting there and grinning at you, being like, okay, well, go ahead. We'll watch this. And I think that's important for the choice movement, that you have to be careful of those parochial fights between groups. I'm not going to say that it's an out-and-out fight, but I can see the battle lines. I can see where some of that stuff starts to get disjointed, and we have to be careful of that.
Yeah, when the lute music starts playing, get the heck out of there.
Yeah.
No, okay, Adam, I think you'll have the last word here.
Well, really quickly, I think we're seeing more siloing, because in the past we had strong leaders, strong politicians, governors, speakers, and others who supported an all of the above approach. And, we're looking for quarterbacks now. There's always quarterbacks. Who's the quarterback for this? Who's the quarterback for that? The quarterback used to be the strong governor or the strong, politician who pulled everyone together and said, I support education reform, I support an all of the above solution. We're seeing a lot less of that nowadays. And I think the best way that we can get back to those days are by getting coalitions together to set aside their differences and say, hey, if we become a strong political force, as strong as the Lannisters, we'll get those politicians back in our corner who will want to push our policies because it's a win for them. But right now, when they're hearing from the charter school groups, the private school groups, the other groups, blah, 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 and they're going to see a different lawmaker every single day, you get fatigue and you feel like, well, what am I getting out of this? And we need to have more of a coalition that's thinking about the child from a holistic approach and say, I don't just care about private schools or charter schools or open enrollment. I care about all of them because I want to put the child in the best place. And that's a selling political message that we can get more governors and more speakers and more presidents out there talking about.
Great. If we can give our panel a round of applause.